Well, I suppose we can go ahead and get started now. So let's find a comfortable seat. Where you can relax for this moment. And gently bring your attention into here and now. So gently releasing some of the energy that's going out into other things. And call it back to settle into present moment awareness. And having settled our mind in this way, you can recall your spiritual teacher, the main one for you. And if you don't have a clear vision of that, you can imagine Shakyamuni Buddha. And having established this connection with them, you can bring to mind what it is that's motivating you to be here this evening. To exploring Buddhist teachings, particularly in the small scope of the Lamrim. And in order to bring about that result, we can imagine taking steps on our spiritual path. We can imagine our activities this evening of listening, sharing our perspectives, contemplating the Dharma, all of these things and many others. We can envision them actually helping us move forward on our spiritual path, actually producing that result in some small or large way. And in order to do that, we can recite the refuge and bodhicitta prayer. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. So having said that, we can imagine our spiritual teacher coming and residing, or Shakyamuni Buddha coming and residing above our head for the remainder of this program. So thank you all once again for joining. I'm gonna see what the chat has to say. No worries. Is everybody able to hear me okay? I'm on a relatively near computer and I don't know how it works, so good. Okay, thank you. So that opening little motivation was to try to call us back to the ending motivation that we did in last session, just really trying to connect with why it is that we're studying and practicing the Dharma, and to try to help that come alive for us, because it's really through familiarization with our own motivation, cultivating it, so developing it in whatever ways we see fit. The tradition has ways that it suggests it sees fit. We should want to become a Buddha as quickly as we possibly can, because there's so much suffering and it doesn't have to be that way, right? That's one iteration. But those words can sometimes be really far away for us. I have been known myself to articulate those sorts of things, but not really have it connecting deep in my heart. And I find that staying with, sometimes keeping that big picture sort of motivation is really helpful, but also getting something that is a little bit more of a small step or a little more approachable can actually bring more life into the practice itself, and into the studies and things like that. So that's part of our responsibility as practitioners and people who are studying the Dharma, or studying any spiritual tradition. From my perspective, it's like, how do we generate the motivation and sustain it over time? So I think periodically going back and checking in on, like, oh yeah, why am I doing this, is a really helpful thing. I'd like to do just a little bit of a review, and then we'll drop into talking a little bit about the first couple topics in the small scope, which are precious human rebirth and death and impermanence. So last week I kind of broke down that refuge and bodhicitta prayer a little bit, not necessarily in like a traditional word commentary, but I wanted us to look at, well, what is, by my practice of giving and other perfections, so like, what is that? Well, that's by my practice of giving. So that's an activity, it's an action. So we can actually become a Buddha through doing the things that will affect that result, that will cause us to become a Buddha. So my sort of short synopsis at the end was like, do these things, become a Buddha, help others, and party on, right? So it's like we do these activities, we do spiritual practice so that we may continue to develop our own mental continuum, our own mind, and also have our actions of body and speech as well kind of follow in accord with that, to produce the kinds of results that we're looking for, which are, non-harming, which are, to enhance our own awareness of the nature of suffering, for instance, or our own ability to generate equanimity or loving kindness, etc. And then through all of that development, we can eventually get to a point where we can become a Buddha. And then by doing that, we can be most effective at helping others. They say that the state of a Buddha is pretty blissful. So that's why I just threw in the party on there, although most of our parties are often afflicted. Most of the parties I've been to are afflicted in some way or another. So maybe think Pure Land party. I don't know exactly. So as we've already talked a little bit about, getting personally clear on why it is that we're practicing the Dharma and what it is about the small scope that is helping our motivation. I also talked a little bit about a couple different ways of approaching the teachings. And one of the ones I wanted to utilize a little bit more in this course is to look at what the result of a particular practice or a particular study is supposed to be. And it's kind of like using a cookbook, right? You open the cookbook and you don't immediately start reading through the ingredients and then the recipe. You look and you're like, oh man, that cake looks stellar. Or, that main course, I'm not much of a cook, so that curry dish looks amazing. So then you actually are like, oh, I see what this result is supposed to be, right? We have some kind of like sense of, oh yeah, those flavors would be good, or I like this, so I might like that a lot. And then we dig in, so once we get a sense of what it's supposed to be, then we get the motivation to actually examine the recipe, look at the ingredients in depth and figure out whether we can actually perform, the activities of the chef in that sort of a moment. And then if we think we can do it, we go for it. So by us trying to stay connected with or focusing initially on the results of the practice, I think that will help maybe crystallize our own motivation and give a little bit more energy into staying with the practices. So that's a little, slightly different approach for these sorts of things. So one way that Yangtze Rinpoche, who's one of my main teachers, he has a book that's called Practicing the Path. It's a Lamrim commentary. He says the path and practices of the small scope are based on the practices that seek to eliminate the mentality that grasps at the appearance of this lifetime and cultivate the mentality that seeks the benefits of future lifetimes. There's quite a bit that's actually packed in there, but one way to look at it is in terms of two sorts of aspects. So we're seeking to eliminate the mentality that grasps at this lifetime and to, he said, the appearances of this lifetime, which is a more technical philosophical point, but we can just kind of for now truncate that and just say that grasps at this lifetime alone. And we cultivate the mentality, which is the second part, that seeks the benefit of future lifetimes. In one way, the teachings on the precious human rebirth and death and impermanence are to help us turn our minds away from this life alone. And then the practices of refuge and studying karma and sort of integrating an awareness of karma into our daily lives, cultivating virtue because it produces the result of happiness in the long run, and minimizing or eliminating non-virtue because it actually leads to suffering, is this mentality that seeks the benefit of future lifetimes. So one kind of interesting way of examining that. One other question I wanted to kind of put up at the front is that'll guide us a little bit. And there's a slight digression I'll get into after I ask these questions or present these. So one of the questions is, how do the topics of precious human rebirth, impermanence and death, how do they actually motivate us? How can they motivate me personally? Similarly, how do refuge and reflection on karma help us affect a better rebirth? This is kind of digging into the why, or I don't know if it's how or why at this point, the how and why of what these practices can really actually do for us. Because largely precious human rebirth and death and impermanence are intended to motivate us towards spiritual practice. Refuging and reflecting on karma is how we actually really start to engage in that spiritual practice a little bit more deeply. Arguably, like studying precious human rebirth and permanence and death and things like that is Dharma practice too. I don't want to say you're not doing any Dharma until you take refuge. That technically is a topic of debate, but insofar as we're sincerely exploring these topics and trying to figure out what's being said, et cetera, and like integrate it into our lives, I would argue that we're taking we're engaging in spiritual practice as a result of that. So that's a little bit of an overview and an extension. Does anybody have any questions about anything that I just said there, or anything that kind of came up in any reflections that might have come from the previous class? Okay. There's more to come, I'm sure. And before dropping into the discussion of precious human rebirth, I thought I'd offer one quote by Geshe Sopa, who I don't know if anybody knows who he was. He passed away several years back, but he was a person who went through the monastic education system in Tibet, I believe. I don't know if he finished there or if he finished in exile, but he was one of His Holiness's debate partners in His Holiness's Geshe debates. He also was assigned to go teach Westerners here in the United States, taught at the University of Wisconsin for quite a long time, and is responsible for helping many of the Western scholars that study Buddhism at this time. He has a 5-book commentary on the Lamrim Genmo that I find to be really helpful. It is quite in depth. It's not exactly a fast read, but if you're familiar with the material already, it takes it into a really beautiful, clear level. It was basically teachings that he gave that were then edited by his PhD students. So it's written in fairly academic, but also, I think, fairly accessible language for Westerners. So one of the things Geshe Sopa says about the approach to the Lamrim, he says, in the Lamrim system, some topics have brief explanations while others are more extensive. For each topic, you should study and think about what is taught in the text, then contemplate it. Look at each topic from many different points of view and relate it to your own experience. You should work on each topic for as many days or months as it takes to produce the mental attitude that the text describes. All this effort will take you in the right direction. So one of the things I like to emphasize in this is, he's basically talking about the 3 wisdoms that I had mentioned before. So the wisdom of hearing, or the wisdom of study, then there's the wisdom of contemplation, and then the wisdom of meditation. So he's saying you should study and think about the text, think about what's taught in the text, and then contemplate it. So you look at it from a lot of different views, but also, this is a really key point from my perspective, relate it to your own experience. that's one of the ways that the Dharma actually will come alive for us. And then this is the sweet one. Work on each topic for as many days or months. He didn't happen to say years in there, but we can infer he would mean years if that's what it takes for us to produce the mental attitude that's described in the text. So that's a sweet little guideline, I think, for us. So that said, the purpose is really mental transformation. So I think it's really great that the text actually gives us those tools to be able to recognize what is supposed to be affected, what mental state's supposed to be brought about, and then it gives us a good map on how to get there. So one digression that I'm going to come back to is I do have a list of what I consider to be kind of guiding questions for studying the Lamrim. I'll have those posted, or studying Dharma in general, but it's a little more tailored to the small scope right now. I will have Venerable Dundrup post those just so you have them as a reference. You don't have to. You can do with them as you will, right? You can say, oh, these are interesting questions, and then engage one or two, or you might say, oh, you know what, that isn't a rubric that kind of works for me, so that's totally fine. But I thought it's a kind of a nice way to like make our intellectual and practical, or our practice engagement a little bit more explicit. The questions can do that sometimes for us. So that's the hope with those. So with my wish to have a bit of personal engagement with these topics, it's important for me to help us see and to acknowledge the places where we can understand, and then we can study, and the understanding becomes a bit deeper. But then we can also reflect on ways that obstacles will arise for us. And a lot of my talking right at this moment is quite abstract, but maybe it will become a little bit more tangible when we get into the topics more specifically. But it's a totally legitimate activity to recognize when there's some tension that's coming up for us in the study of Dharma, and to acknowledge that, to be aware of it, and to ask some questions around it, like, oh, like I don't really jive with, or I don't really resonate with that teaching, or actually I have strong aversion to that. And being able to take that information, oh, there's aversion arising to the idea of the hell realms, for example, to be able to take that aversion and say, oh, I acknowledge that, I can appreciate that, I understand. And then we can dig in. Sometimes we can get a sense of like, oh, there's there's obstacles coming up because of this, that, or the other, right? And those might be legitimate things in our experience, or they might be kind of fanciful ideas. It's like, oh, but if we can acknowledge where they're coming from, then we have something to be able to work with. But we also get a chance to see the ways that our attachment, for instance, or our aversion, these obstacles that arise, how they might shape the way that we engage and study the Dharma. And that isn't, I'm not trying to put a value judgment on any of that. I'm trying to highlight that when we have obstacles that arise, there's something else for us to be able to learn in those moments, right? There's the obstacle that we're facing. There's the reasons for it. The obstacles don't arise just out of nowhere. Poof. There's some sort of causal lineage with them, so to speak. And if we can get a sense of where all that's coming from, then we have a better sense of, oh, these are the adjustments that would be needed for me to be able to move through that. Or, oh, these are the adjustments that this is how I'd have to come to terms with this aspect of the teaching to be able to integrate it further. Again, this is very abstract language right now. And maybe we'll end up coming across something that creates this situation for us, and then we'll maybe have some personal examples that you don't have to share. Or maybe we'll come with, maybe I'll have one of my own arise, and I'll be able to share that as like, oh yeah, that's a great example. I think part of the point of me wanting to look at challenges in that sort of way is it's, from my perspective, it's important to be able to keep the energy moving a little bit. And sometimes when an obstacle, like a big wall comes up, it's like, we don't have to necessarily try to hammer our way through the wall. We can be like, oh, like, how is it made, right? Is it a bunch of bricks that somebody put together? Is it a thicket that's grown that we just can't see through? You know, there's a bunch of brambles or something like that. So that, I mean, there's that in itself, like, keeps the energy moving. It keeps the mind still actively working, but it's not trying to necessarily power through, and it's not necessarily just running away. Running away sometimes is a legitimate activity when obstacles arise. I'm not trying to pretend that it's not, but we get to explore those situations. Okay, enough of that very abstract contemplation. I'm just taking a quick look at some questions. So, Aaron, I'll hopefully address that question at some point, right? But it's going to take us off a little bit right now. I want to dig into the topic. So it's a good question. And the answer, in my opinion, is yes, go back. That's the short one. One way that Geshe Sopa, he doesn't say this is the result, but he say, when he's at one point in the commentary in the volume 1, he's talking about how to take the essence of this life. And in the small scope concept, he says the basis of taking the essence of this life is to recognize 3 things. One is how special it is, how useful it is, and finally, how suddenly you can lose your life, and how difficult it is to obtain such a life again. So, in the context of looking at the results of the small scope study and practice, one aspect is exactly this: how special the life that we have is. Another is how useful it is, which isn't separate from it being special, but it's also really useful. And then also the third aspect is, like, we have this ability to lose our lives at a moment's notice, or not a notice, in a moment. And it's also really difficult to obtain it again. So that's kind of the one way to look at the result of this study in this segment. The question is, how does Lama Tsongkhapa in the Lamrim Genmo support those conclusions? So how does he make an argument for those sorts of conclusions? So that's what we get to explore now. The other aspect that I think I mentioned last time is we will be able to go through some of the reasons in the Lamrim that those results are what they are, you know. So we'll be able to go through some of the traditional reasons of why life is really special, why precious human rebirth is in fact precious, why we have it, etc. It's important to study those aspects of the teachings, but it's also important from my perspective to make them applicable in our own lives. So we'll find things that easily overlap, and then there'll be things that are articulated in the teachings that are much more remote. So we also need to be able to make it personal. So if there's something that is outside of what's said in the tradition that helps us realize how precious our rebirth is, then that may be a legitimate, advantageous part of our contemplation of precious human rebirth. Does that make some sense? So it doesn't have to be just what the tradition says. We have to, as Geshe Sopa, as I quoted him earlier, it's like we've got to see how it applies to our own lives, how it relates to our own experience. That's part of the personal work here. So hopping in now to our discussion of the precious human rebirth. That section is really kind of focused on what are called the leisures and opportunities. Leisures are, in the sense they're talked about as freedom from 8 sort of states or conditions where there isn't any opportunity to practice Dharma at all. The opportunities, or they're sometimes called endowments, are 10 fortunate circumstances that enable us to be able to practice the Dharma. So there's kind of a negative side. Oh, the leisure, having one of the leisures means we are not afflicted by something that will prevent us from practicing the Dharma. The opportunities are the things that actually allow us to do it. So there's kind of a negative perspective and a positive perspective there. So I'm kind of curious if anybody has something in mind that maybe is related to Dharma, but not necessarily the bullet points. If you have the 8 leisures and 10 opportunities memorized, what sort of thing in your own mind from your own experience would prevent you from being able to practice Dharma or to practice spirituality in any way? What sort of things are out there, or that are internal or external conditions that actually would enhance or facilitate your ability to practice?
Presence of like co-practitioners, or the presence of people who are kind of hostile to Buddhism.
Yeah, that actually happens to be, at least in the first part, that there are people practicing the Dharma is considered one of the 10 opportunities. Yeah. And why is that? I mean, what does that mean for you as an individual, or somebody else who's practicing? Like, why does having other practitioners help or matter?
I think it helps in a few ways. Like, one is because it's a larger Buddha field if there's more people. Another thing that is relevant is that it allows you to practice with others and kind of learn from each other.
Mm-hmm.
And it acts as kind of like accountability as well. It also, like in a larger sense, certain practices will require like a guru who knows things. And if you're not around other practitioners, you're probably less likely to find one.
Yeah. Yeah, I think those are all great reasons. Yeah. There's a tremendous amount of support that can come from community. Yes, Barbara.
The thing that comes to mind for me is that the karma has ripened, or the karma hasn't ripened to be interested in studying the Dharma.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's that's great. One of the ways that it is kind of articulated that's similar to that, that is one of the opportunities, is faith in the Lamrim or faith in the Dharma, right? So there's what you were saying is, it's available to you. I mean, that's another one. It's like actually, so you have community, you actually have access to the spiritual teachings from Shakyamuni Buddha, but then there's also, the faith, and that could be something that was generated only in this lifetime, or you could consider it as something that is part of your, karma that's ripening. You've done practice in the past, or, had generosity or whatever it is that would lead you to that. So yeah, I think that's a good one. Yeah. And I don't, and Donnie, or is it Danny or Donnie? I don't know which is the best pronunciation for you.
It's not easy for me to get back in. Danny.
Danny, okay, thanks.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm looking at Danny's chat here as well. So
if you can hear me, I can try to explain.
yeah, we can hear you. I can hear you.
Okay. Well, it's a bandwidth thing. What would happen would it would get choppy and I drop off. I enjoy practicing, whether it's good or bad or successful or unsuccessful or perfect or not, because it's never going to be any of those things. I'm doing this now for sentient beings. Once I got that down and took some guidance and started following the precepts and keeping those rules, then things started happening. And now my practice it is getting better. My meditation is getting stronger. Everything is just, but it took a long time, at least 20 years.
Congratulations.
I'm not there yet, but yeah, thanks.
You're somewhere though. I mean, you just described it's taken you a long time, but there's actually some momentum and there's some benefit that's coming. So, good job sticking with it, and having enough connection and continuity in your own practice. That's really it's worthy of rejoicing in, for sure. No question about that. So we haven't talked too much about the leisure. So the things that we have freedom from, because if we didn't, we just simply wouldn't be able to practice the Dharma. So traditionally, the leisures are described as, we're not born in the hell realms, we're not born in the Preta realm. So Preta is a hungry ghost. So a being that's affected by extreme hunger and thirst pretty much constantly, and also has difficult actually drinking or eating. And if they do, then there's negative results that come from that too. So we're not born, we have the leisure of not being born in the hell realm, not being born as a Preta, not being born as an animal. This is more debatable in our culture as being such a negative thing, but the tradition will explain it in a particular way. Also not being born as a long life God. So there, from Buddhist cosmological perspective, there are beings that have very long lives. They are abiding in pretty blissful and pretty pleasurable experiences, but that isn't something that helps us with our Dharma practice. Another leisure is being born where a Buddha has, or not being born where a Buddha has descended. A leisure is being born where a Buddha has descended, so where a Buddha has taken birth. Another one is where they have taught. We have not been born, a leisure is not being born with gross physical or mental defects. And the last that is articulated is not having strong wrong views. That the last one has to do with believing unequivocally without any space for it being different, but believing unequivocally that there is no karma, there's absolutely no possibility of rebirth, that there's absolutely no possibility of being able to cultivate the positive potential of our mind limitlessly. So those sorts of things, in particular karma, in this section of the text, not believing or believing that karma does not exist at all is would basically lead you to not being able to practice the Dharma, right? So when we think about the realms that are described, so the hell realms, the preta, the animals, and what it means that they are unable to practice the Dharma, part of what we're asked to do is imagine the type of suffering that those beings are going through, or imagine the type of limitation for spiritual development if we don't have a reasonable amount of intelligence, even if we have a human body. If we don't have a human mind that's pretty functional, it becomes very difficult to practice the Dharma. Likewise, if we have a tremendous amount of physical suffering, even in this body, it becomes very difficult. Barb, do you have your hand raised? Oh no, that's my that was my pointer. It was on your square and it was a hand raised. So so we can memorize those leisures, but we can also reflect on times in our lives when we've been really occupied with something else other than our Dharma practice that makes absolutely minimal or almost no space for us to be able to practice, right? And we can imagine a type of existence where that is what's operating all the time. And if we reflect on what it was like to be in that state, it starts to give us a window into how valuable these times when we do have these leisures, whether the traditional ones or the personal ones that we recognize, like, not too long ago, I had some nerve pain in my neck, and it was pretty overwhelming. I was in the most pain that I've been in my life for like multiple days. It's not very much. I've been incredibly fortunate to not have a lot of illness and to have a pretty functional body. But this, short period of time, I could certainly sit on my cushion and recite prayers that I'd memorized, but actually being able to like drop in and do some real practice was very, very difficult, And that's just a little bit of suffering compared to what the tradition describes as like existing as a hell realm being, or like being really, 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 really hungry and thirsty all of the time. If we can imagine what that would be like, then we can understand, oh my gosh, like, of course I wouldn't be able to do much in terms of Dharma practice in those conditions. Maybe we've seen friends that are in a similar situation, right? There's been something that has just really occupied their mind in such a way that that's all that's there, Yes, Jai.
Okay, I'm a little unclear sometimes with this sort of approach, which sounds like, I don't know how else to put this, it's not tactful. It sounds like a bit of a threat. It's sort of like, oh my God, here's what can happen to you, like the fear of hell. if you or this could be your condition if you don't practice. It sounds like a very negative motivation to me for practice. I can certainly well understand, that feeling of compassion and wanting to do it for others. There's also a certain part of me that just kind of intuitively, you want to do the right thing. When I hear this sort of negative, it sounds like a threat in a certain aspect to me. I'm just expressing what comes up, right? And this is stuff I do work on. Yeah. Okay.
There are aspects of the small scope teachings, the teachings in precious human rebirth and impermanence and death. There is more that can be thought of or experienced as threatening. I can't personally speak for the motivation of every Buddhist teacher, like what they're trying to have people become aware of. But there is an aspect of really wanting people to recognize the actual tremendous value that they have in the particular rebirth that they have right now, or the particular opportunity. And sometimes that comes through articulating what the alternative from a Buddhist perspective has been for us for many lifetimes, right? And based on the worldview of we will continue to cycle in afflicted existence, aka samsara, until we create the causes to get out of it. And while we're still cycling in samsara, we are liable to backsliding. We are liable to having, moments of anger arise at the time of death, for instance, that turn our next rebirth in a less than desirable way. There is a way of viewing it that way. But the other side of that exact same coin is, oh my gosh, we actually have so much opportunity to cultivate positive qualities. And we have so much opportunity to actually do the sorts of things that will ensure that we have another great opportunity in our next rebirth. Or at the very least, even if we don't ascribe to the belief in mental continuum, going from this particular body, being able to continue on and taking rebirth in another body, even if we don't believe that, we can still look, and hopefully we could talk about this a little bit with karma, but we can still look at the state of mind and the ease that's developed through cultivating ethical conduct, cultivating equanimity, cultivating concentration. All of these things can be actual results that we can experience in this lifetime that are integrated. I mean, they're like integral to having a precious human rebirth. The good news is, on the one, we've got all this opportunity. The bad news is we can squander it.
You can't see me, so I'm nodding my head in agreement.
Yeah.
I just want to let you know that.
Thank you.
And I can tell you where my squandering goes. I'm very clear about that. I am so distracted with COVID. I'm in Australia. We've got floods. We've got, obviously the Ukraine. All of that stuff pulls my energy away and distracts me tremendously from being able to do what we're talking about here, is to put my attention on sadhana, on spiritual growth.
Yeah. Well, thank you for pulling your attention away, at least momentarily, and joining us here. And, I think that practically speaking, even if we can't give as much attention to our Dharma practice as we would like, trying to keep some continuity can be really helpful over time. Some just staying connected with some thread, whether it's, you know, a couple of mantras that you do a day, or one sort of prayer, or I'm going to spend 5 minutes observing my breath for the purpose, you know, breath meditation can be really beneficial. It becomes more beneficial from a Buddhist perspective if we integrate a Buddhist motivation for doing it in the first place. So those sorts of small things that we can be very distracted and most of the time can be occupied by distraction, but if we can keep some continuity and keep our mind connected, can have the aspiration. So like, for instance, when I was in a bit of physical pain, I understood that my ability to do practice in the way that I wanted to was very limited. But I also could make the aspiration to wanting to be able to do more practice when this wave of discomfort subsides. So sometimes like cueing the future, you know, cueing the mind, like setting the seed for the mind to be able to re-engage and reinvigorate when some of the things get cleared out, I think can be really helpful. So yes, I too am distracted by, you know, current events. So I get that completely. So when we reflect on the leisures, we don't necessarily have to believe in all of these different realms. We just have to get to the point where we realize there is not something that is, or maybe there is something, but there are a minimum of things that are really, that would completely prevent me from being able to practice the Dharma. That's the point of the leisures. When we have that aspect, we can recognize on the one side how valuable this human life is. Moving on to the opportunities, I'll just kind of run through the list because I'd rather have us focus on the latter part of what I just talked about. So, which is just having the realization that there are these internal conducive circumstances and these external conducive circumstances for us being able to practice the Dharma. So I'll leave it at that. For the first 5, they usually talk about them as internal circumstances. So they're particular to us. So one, we're born human. The second is we're born in a central place. That can be looked at in a couple of different ways. It could either be looked at geographically, which doesn't make as much sense in a contemporary way, but it's also looked at in terms of, or interpreted as, there are the 4 types of ordination. So there are novice, nuns and monks, and fully ordained nuns and monks. So that's one of the opportunities. The third is having perfect and complete sense faculties and sense organs. So our mind can operate well. The 4th is not having committed the 5 heinous crimes. So these are particular actions that make it very difficult for us to have progress on our spiritual path in this lifetime. And then the 5th is there's some faith in the Lamrim, or the teachings of the Buddha. This isn't a blind faith. It's just, we get to some point where we like, you know, this is starting to make sense to me. I get it. And I believe this might be an effective path. So I'm willing to explore it and engage it, right? It doesn't have to be the sort of faith that's like, you know, everything the Buddha always, you know, said in every instance is perfect or something like that. That's like a different level of, it's a weird example, but it's a different level of faith. So the sixth is being born where a Buddha has descended. The seventh, born where a Buddha has taught. Eighth, that the teachings still remain in the world. The ninth, people are practicing the Dharma. And the 10th is there are people supporting the practice of Dharma. So there are the material resources for people to continue to engage in the study and practice of Buddhism. So these 10 are the fortunate circumstances that allow us to really practice the Dharma, right? As Aaron said, if there aren't any Buddhist teachings, how are we going to practice the Dharma? It's not to say it's completely impossible, but it's much more difficult than, oh, we've got this Lamrim, we've got these teachings on the stages of the path. There's the map. You know, it's much easier with that. Are there any, sort of personal opportunities, or does anybody have anything they'd like to share about either the idea of leisures or opportunities? Does anybody want to share an obstacle they have to recognizing their precious human? Oh, I'm sorry, Caitlin. I just was looking down and please continue.
Yeah, well, this is me talking about leisures and opportunities and also sharing an obstacle, which is when you were asking the question, the first thought that came to my mind was just the ordinary mind. Either like, it just seems like how narrow the window can be for practice. And if there's dissatisfaction, then there becomes like lack of motivation for me personally, like extreme dissatisfaction. But then if there's extreme contentment, I get lazy sometimes. So it's like, for me, it's just like laziness and depression on the opposite ends. And how do I I guess as I'm hearing you talk, I'm wondering, how do I just widen that window so that that sweet spot, which I think is so beautifully articulated by, being a human, not being on the one hand in the suffering realms, and on the other hand, not being in the God realms where you're too happy and distracted.
Right. Yeah. This is a really good question. There isn't anything like specific that's coming like quickly to mind about that, but I have a feeling it has something to do with kind of like consistent reflection on the value of the opportunity of the human rebirth, and maybe including some like aspiration to expand the awareness of that preciousness at those moments when you're on either side of the scales. So we can make the aspiration to want to develop concentration, and that moves a bunch of energy in that direction, right? So that's just one example. Or we can have the aspiration to like learn how to paint, and if we have that aspiration and the energy is moving in that way, we're much more likely to become better at painting than we were if we had an aspiration to watch 7 hours of Netflix every day, right? I don't know that 7 hours of Netflix every day. I don't know there's enough content to teach you about painting in Netflix for 7 hours every day, but maybe there is. I don't know. My point is, like, wherever we want to kind of grow or develop, we can set some intention to actually do that. And, you know, on the one hand, like when the depression is starting to manifest, maybe there's a, you know, if this wish to be able to stay connected with the value of human rebirth has been set, maybe there'll be a moment where it's like, oh, I get it. This is still really crappy, but I'm also getting it. And oh, like, I mean, honestly, the latter one, I'm in the American version of the bliss of the God realm. You know, the teachings on impermanence and death actually directly address that, right? Because it's like, hey, you know, things are going to change for you, whether you like it or not. So when we are in those kind of like, everything is rolling, you know, everything is feeling good, things are connected, it's like, it feels good to be alive. We don't necessarily need to like squash it and say, no, it doesn't, because inevitably we're going to die. We can say, wow, it feels good to be alive, and may I continue to have this opportunity, and may I put the kind of elated mental states, may I take some of that really positive energy and move it into aspects that will help me experience this more and more, you know. And it generally isn't the things that we were doing. I mean, it is sometimes the things that we were doing, you know, being connected with friends, or like, oh, we've got a cool project, or, oh, you know, we just did X, Y, or Z, right? But maybe being able to connect the Dharma with that too, you know, and then have the energy not just be going into that, but also like integrating the Dharma into those things. I don't know, I'm talking a lot and maybe some of it's landing, but.
Yeah, it is. Thanks.
Okay. Part of getting more clear on our motivation for practice is to be able to make it so it's more accessible to us. If it's just the words of the tradition, there's benefit in that. But when it becomes personal, then we're able to actually integrate it into more of our life. And then it becomes more pervasive. And if it's a positive motivation, it just produces positive results in the long run. We don't necessarily need to fixate on like, oh, why am I doing everything that I'm doing all of the time? But saying, oh, like, I have an opportunity here to offer something to somebody. May it really be of benefit to them, or whatever sort of positive motivation connected with your own intention, I think is really helpful. So somehow I feel like the way I've talked about the leisures and opportunities isn't really gonna like really get us motivated to see the value of human life. I mean, the conclusion that's supposed to come from really looking at this is, wow, I am incredibly fortunate to have met the Dharma, to have many of the conditions to be able to practice, to transform my mind through these practices. And because I have this opportunity, I'm going to engage it, and I'm going to do these things. And I'm going to stay with it. I'm going to practice diligently. So the question I offer to you for reflection on your own is like, what would help me personally, not me, Daryl, but you personally, increase your awareness of the value of your life just a little bit more? The value of the opportunity that you have just a little bit more. Maybe a lot more, but at least just a little bit. That value may come more into relief, like become more apparent, more evident by the next section, which is on death and impermanence. For most of us, for most of our lives, we don't think that we could die in the next moment. Which, if we were operating in that without any sort of spiritual support, it'd probably be pretty crappy way to operate, right? It'd be pretty hard if we were constantly afraid of dying or concerned with death, or it might just come. I guess there's a variety of ways to interact with that or to relate to that. But most of the time, we haven't integrated this sense that, yeah, I could be going to work tomorrow and I could pass away due to causes outside of my own control or partly my control. You know, I chose to drive on the highway or, you know, whatever it was, ride my bike. So we often will just be kind of going along as normal. Not spending much time kind of bringing a little bit more to the center and more to the front the things that we really believe matter in our lives. Instead, we watch 7 hours of cooking shows on Netflix or on the internet or whatever, you know, whatever it would be. So part of this teaching on death comes after we've talked a little bit about precious human rebirth. So we get this interesting juxtaposition of, I could die at any time, but also what I have right now is pretty valuable, right? Those two things coupled together, pretty valuable. I tend to understate things sometimes. It's extraordinarily valuable, right? So what I have is very, from the Buddhist tradition's perspective, very, very difficult to obtain. Even sustaining, I mean, this gets into aspects of impermanence and death, like the body is fragile, et cetera. But even sustaining the abilities to practice requires a lot of support. Like I said, we have to have water to drink and food and a community that is supportive. Community in the greater sense, at least there's not people interfering with what we're trying to do. In the positive sense, there's people actually helping us engage and study. So kind of the benefit of reflecting on death and impermanence. So basically reflecting on we're going to lose the opportunity that we have. We'll have a different opportunity that could be worse. The main purpose of reflecting on that is to help motivate us. It is sort of a motivation from concern for the negative, right? And that, I mean, it is a motivation of fear. This is how it's articulated in this section of the Lamrim. Any thoughts kind of going through minds, any of your minds, anything you'd like to share? Or
Yes, I'll volunteer.
please.
I can, and as I look around at the faces, I can see I'm probably the oldest one here, and I can hear the sands ticking through that hourglass very loudly, yeah, which is okay. But when I go to be tempted to watch Netflix or read the news and then have the reaction that I do, one of the questions I continuously come back to is, okay, is this doing me any good from an ultimate sense? Is it doing anyone else any good from an ultimate sense? And that tends to bring me back to more of a spiritual path than just letting my energy get consumed with the distractions that are so available to me.
Yeah, that sounds like excellent spiritual practice from my perspective, you know. It's a matter of being aware of what your mind is doing and then moving it in a direction that you want to. You know, I think that that's perfect. And that's the sort of awareness and agency that really can help us in the long run. Yeah. Yeah, and Danny wrote, it's a good fear for her or them, I'm not sure, which helps spur out of sloth. So that's sometimes a little bit of concern for, oh no, like, oh no, those are the results I'm going to get to experience, is not a bad thing. A little bit of stress can be okay. But it always can be kind of tempered or juxtaposed with the positive side, right? You know, the fear of the negative can also be coupled with the motivation of like full flourishing, right? So no, we don't want to have this really awful rebirth, but we also can really want to have a very integrated mode of existing in the world. That one, I mean, both of them will affect us differently, but we can really, I mean, we can say the words, may I become a Buddha, like the more we understand what that state is said to be, I think the easier it is to like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I want to operate in that way. I'm just trying not to let us like drop too down into the negative side of things. There was, you know, I remember reading something about, you know, in some scholarship on the Pali Canon where the Shakyamuni Buddha had offered these meditations on I I think the sort of like the grossness and the negativity of the body. And then apparently monks and nuns were doing them, and then a bunch of them were just committing suicide because it was like, this is so disgusting, or it's like so worthless, like I'm just done with it. And then he's like, wait, no, like that's taking it a little bit too far. So they were able to reel it back from that. But yeah, we live in a little bit of a different culture than 15th century Tibet. And I think there's some things that are important for us to find some balance with. And, yes, we should get motivated by these negative possibilities, but we want to avoid being paralyzed by them. And we want to avoid having them be all of what our vision is capable of holding. So we find the balance of imagining limitlessly developing our positive potential and eliminating every trace of negativity that could cause us to have one of these not so stellar rebirths. So we're a little short on time to dip into a meditation that's called meditating on the 3 roots, 9 reasonings, and 3 conclusions, which is basically a short little synopsis of how to get us motivated to practice Dharma. Because the 3 roots, the core of it is death is certain, the time of death is uncertain, is the second one. And the only thing that will that will help us at the time of death is our Dharma practice. So maybe it'd be good to reflect on, you can certainly reflect on those things. You can maybe look up, I think on the page for this course, there was posted maybe an outline of this sort of a meditation. You can find it in many of the Lamrim commentaries, but you can reflect on that. Perhaps spending a little bit of time with this death is certain and the time of death is uncertain. We have lots of examples in the world right now that make this very real, maybe not for us like immediately, but certainly for many, many, thousands of other people, right? And the unfortunate reality is that's the way it is all of the time for many, 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 many people on earth, for ourselves included, right? Like I said, I could walk down the stairs and slip, and that could be the end of it for me, for this iteration. But we're also seeing some, with the war in Ukraine, or the other bombings that are taking places in other parts of the world, or with a lot of the drugs in the country, there's the illegal drugs, where there's a lot of fentanyl, for example. People are maybe just looking for a little bit of a respite from pain, but they're actually dying because they overdose and they didn't even intend to or mean to. So, I mean, how tragic is that? We're looking for relief, but it ends up being what kills us, right? So, so being able to reflect on death is certain, the time of death is uncertain, and also on what's my go-to? What do I think will help me at the time of my death? just something to explore. And thanks for the comment, Jai, about the 9-point meditation. It is there, and you can do that on a daily basis if you want, or every other day, or something like that. But I think making it personal is really valuable. We have just a couple minutes left. Any other thoughts or something anybody would like to share? Well, I'd like to say thank you for joining this evening and bearing with. I feel a little clunky tonight, so hopefully I'll be a little less clunky for the next session. So thanks for bearing with me. We can do one final sort of little meditation and so find a comfortable position to be in. Bring your mind back to your teacher that is seated above the crown of your head. And bring some awareness to the positive actions that we've engaged in here this evening. Some brief exploration of the value, the preciousness of our rebirth. A brief reflection on death and impermanence. That we will not have this precious opportunity indefinitely. And we can dedicate the merit, so the boon, the benefit that arises from those actions. We can dedicate it specifically to being able to take full advantage of the opportunities that we have to generate the realizations expressed in the Lamrim, small scope teachings, as well as the later teachings in this very lifetime. So we can dedicate to being able to generate those realizations. We can dedicate to being able to help others do the same. We can dedicate the virtue of those actions to being able to end all wars. To generating all of the positive conditions for each and every sentient being to practice Dharma. And to be able to sustain that all the way till they reach the end of their spiritual path, the full development of their minds. the brief traditional dedication. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that is not arisen arise and grow. May that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. So thank you all so much for participating, and I enjoy having this opportunity, and I look forward to the next time. So thank you all.